Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're diving into a truly pivotal moment in history, the fall of the Iron Curtain. It's 1989, and the Soviet Union's grip on Eastern Europe just crumbles. And get this, it's a revolution, but with almost no bloodshed. So how did this seemingly unshakable empire just let go?
It's really one of those moments that makes you step back and say, wow, how did that happen? And you're right, it wasn't just one event, one protest, or one speech. It was this fascinating convergence of events and decisions that led to this incredibly peaceful yet monumental change.
Right, and to even begin to grasp it all, we've got to start with the lay of the land. It's the late 1980s, and Eastern Europe is basically a constellation of Soviet satellite states. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, all under Moscow's thumb. What allowed them to maintain that control for so long?
Well, for decades, the Soviet Union operated under this policy called the Brezhnev Doctrine. It was established back in 1968, and basically it gave them the green light to use whatever force necessary, including military, to maintain communist rule in those satellite states.
So any sign of dissent, any attempt to stray from the party line, and the tanks would roll in.
You got it. It was all about control.
Wow, talk about pressure. So how do we get from that to peaceful revolutions? It just seems unbelievable.
It is pretty wild when you think about it. And the key to understanding this shift, this complete 180, is understanding one man, Mikhail Gorbachev. He becomes the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985 and decides, okay, time to shake things up. Turns out maybe he shook things up a bit more than he initially planned.
Okay, so let's talk Gorbachev. What was different about him? Why rock the boat when things seemed to be, at least on the surface, relatively stable?
That's the million-dollar question. You see, behind the scenes, the Soviet Union wasn't exactly thriving. The economy was a mess, and keeping those satellite states in line was costing them a fortune. Gorbachev knew something had to give.
So he just decides to abandon the Brezhnev Doctrine. That's a bold move. How did that go over?
It sent shockwaves through the Eastern Bloc. Imagine you're a satellite state, used to living under Moscow's thumb, and suddenly that threat, the very real possibility of tanks rolling in, is gone. The historian, Tony Judt, actually said that Gorbachev pulled the rug out from under these regimes. Their power, their authority, it all rested on the threat of the Soviet military. And now, poof, it was gone.
Wow, that really highlights the power dynamics at play. It wasn't just about differing ideologies, it was about raw power.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is that Gorbachev's decision to abandon this doctrine wasn't just about the satellite states. See, he was also dealing with growing discontent back home in the Soviet Union itself. A stagnant economy, people starting to speak out, the drill. So this wasn't just about being nice to the satellite states, it was about survival.
So this hands-off approach, this stepping back from the Brezhnev Doctrine, it really sets the stage for some incredible events. 1989 rolls around, and it's like this wave of change just washes over Eastern Europe. Were there any moments where Gorbachev really signaled this publicly, like actually told these Eastern Bloc countries, you're on your own now, guys?
Oh, absolutely. There's this one moment, I think it was 1988, Gorbachev gives this speech at the UN, and he basically says, yeah, we're reducing our troops, and by the way, the Brezhnev Doctrine, it's done. No more. It was a pretty powerful statement to make on the world stage. I mean, talk about a mic drop moment. The message was definitely received loud and clear back in the Eastern Bloc. The floodgates were open. They were free to pursue whatever reforms they wanted, and the Soviets weren't going to do a thing to stop them.
Wow, what a moment in history. It's almost like the whole world was holding its breath, watching it all unfold. So with this as the backdrop, are there any particular countries that really illustrate how quickly things unraveled?
Oh yeah, definitely. 3 countries really come to mind. Poland, Hungary, and of course East Germany. Each one tells a different piece of this much bigger story. Let's start with Poland. So by the 80s, they're already pretty restless, There's a lot of resistance brewing.
And a big part of that was the Solidarity movement, right? A trade union basically challenging the might of the Soviet Union. That takes guts.
Oh, for sure. It was incredibly brave. They were led by Lech Walesa, and they gained so much traction, put so much pressure on the Polish government, it was undeniable. And this is where Gorbachev's decision to back off becomes really crucial. I mean, without Soviet tanks to back them up, the Polish government had to find a different way.
So instead of just cracking down, they actually had to come to the table, negotiate.
Exactly. By 1989, the Polish government conceded, and they agreed to hold semi-free elections. It was huge. this major crack in the Iron Curtain. You could really feel the winds of change starting to blow.
Wow, that's one domino down. What about Hungary? What was their story?
So Hungary, they took a different route, but just as impactful. It's 1989, the pressure's mounting on their government, just like in Poland, and they make this, well, radical decision. They open their border with Austria.
Wait, they just opened it, just like that.
Basically, yeah, they were like,
Wow.
it's open. And symbolically, it was huge. I mean, this was the Iron Curtain, this heavily guarded barrier between East and West. And now suddenly, it's got this hole in it.
I bet East Germans who had been wanting to escape to the West for years saw this as their chance.
100%. That open border, it was like an escape route. Thousands of East Germans used it. They're going through Hungary, desperate to reach the West. It was this really powerful symbol, this visual representation of how much Soviet control was slipping. And it put so much pressure on East Germany. They had to do something.
Which brings us to East Germany and the big one, the Berlin Wall. That enduring symbol of a divided world. You know, I was just a kid when it came down, but I remember seeing images on TV, people chipping away at it with hammers and pickaxes. It's hard to forget that.
I know what you mean. It was one of those moments. It's hard to overstate just how powerful that symbol was, right? This physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain dividing a city, a country, the world. And now here it was coming down.
So how did it actually happen? Was it like this spontaneous uprising, or was it planned? What went down?
Well, it was a bit of both. Honestly, remember all those East Germans heading through Hungary?
Yeah.
Yeah, the pressure on the East German government was enormous. I mean, they tried to ease up restrictions here and there, make it seem like they were listening, but it was too little, way too late. And then November 9th, 1989 rolls around. There are protests everywhere. You can feel that energy, that tension, like things are about to boil over.
Yeah.
And then the announcement. The border's open.
And the rest is, well, history. Right.
Just-
But let's zoom out for a second. We've talked about Gorbachev, these incredible events of 1989, but what else is at play here? What were some of those underlying factors that made this domino effect, these peaceful revolutions, even possible?
That's the question, isn't it? It's complicated for sure. There are a lot of moving parts, but probably the biggest factor is the Soviet Union itself. I mean, by the late 80s, their economy, total shambles. The Soviet Union was a superpower on paper, but let's be real, they were struggling to keep up.
So Gorbachev's decision to ditch the Brezhnev Doctrine, that wasn't just ideological, it was also him facing reality. The situation was unsustainable.
Exactly. They just couldn't afford to prop up those satellite states anymore, financially or militarily. And then here's a real twist, right? Gorbachev's own reforms, the changes he thought were going to save the system, they kind of backfire. Policies like Glasnost, which means openness, and Perestroika, which is about restructuring, were supposed to strengthen the Soviet Union. Instead, they helped speed up its demise.
Okay, hold on. How does that even happen? It seems counterintuitive that reforms designed to improve a system would end up, weakening it.
It's funny how history works sometimes. See, Glasnost. It encouraged things like open debate, transparency, all good things. But what it also did was open up this space to criticize the government, the system, and people ran with it. Both within the USSR and in the satellite states, people were speaking out, questioning the status quo. They saw what they were missing, things like free speech, freedom of the press, basic human rights, and they wanted it.
And Perestroika, how did that fit into all of this?
Well, the idea behind Perestroika was to restructure the Soviet economy. I mean, they desperately needed it, right? But it led to all these unintended consequences, things like shortages, instability. It was chaos.
So you have Gorbachev over here trying to hold this whole system together, and his reforms, which were probably well-intentioned, end up adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, pretty much. And on top of all that, don't forget the other crucial thing. No more Soviet military intervention.
Yeah.
That threat, the one that had basically defined the Cold War for decades, it was gone. And that absence, that willingness to use force, was a huge reason why movements like Solidarity in Poland were able to gain so much traction.
It's amazing how those reforms, the ones designed to actually make the Soviet Union stronger, kind of had the opposite effect. They actually helped create the perfect storm for its collapse. Just goes to show you those unintended consequences. Right?
For sure. And, the fact that most of these revolutions were peaceful, that's really remarkable. I mean, revolutions throughout history, they usually don't go down like that.
Yeah.
It really speaks to just how powerful Gorbachev's decision to step back from using military force was.
It makes you realize how even these seemingly rigid systems, these powerful structures, they can change if people are brave enough to demand it. And those in power choose, talking over fighting.
Exactly. And, this whole period, it leads to this really fascinating debate among historians about what actually caused the Soviet Union to lose control, to just like lose its grip on power. It's kind of like trying to put together one of those giant jigsaw puzzles.
Really?
All of these different pieces, right? And they all contribute to the bigger picture.
Oh, a history debate. I love a good history debate. So what are the different schools of thought here?
All right, so you've got some historians, they're often called the Orthodox school, and they place a lot of emphasis on Gorbachev himself. His decisions, those reforms we were talking about, the refusal to use force, they argue those were the decisive factors that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire.
So they see Gorbachev as this, like, architect of change, even if it wasn't intentional.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They see his leadership as the turning point, the catalyst. Then you've got the revisionist historians, and they're less interested in Gorbachev as an individual. They're more focused on the bigger picture. They say the system itself, the Soviet system, was already on shaky ground, especially the economy, and that Gorbachev was, I don't know, just trying to keep it afloat a little longer.
So in their view, the Soviet Union was headed for a collapse, regardless of who was in charge.
Right. Like it was just a matter of time. And then, just to make things even spicier, you've got a third perspective. It's often called the post-Cold War view.
Okay, so the post-Cold War historians, what's their take?
So they see Gorbachev as an important figure, definitely. But not necessarily because he went in there intending to dismantle the whole system. They think he was actually trying to reform it, to make it better, you know. But those reforms, they kind of spiraled out of control and unleashed all these forces he couldn't contain.
It's just amazing to me how a single historical event can have so many interpretations. You know, it reminds you that history isn't this neat and tidy thing. It's messy and complex, and there are always going to be different ways to see it.
And that's what makes it so interesting, right? It's about taking in all these different perspectives, these different interpretations, and then coming to your own conclusions.
So as we kind of zoom out here, what are some key takeaways from this deep dive into the fall of the Iron Curtain? What should people listening in 2024 take away from all of this?
Well, first and foremost, I think it reminds us that even these systems, these institutions that seem untouchable, they can and do crumble. The Soviet Union, the superpower, right?
Yeah.
It dominated for decades and then poof, gone. It really makes you think.
It shows you just how quickly things can change, especially when those in power, they underestimate the will of the people, you know? People's desire for freedom, for self-determination, it's a powerful force.
Right. And on top of that, I think it underscores the power of peaceful change. Those revolutions of '89, they were largely bloodless, which is incredible when you think about it. It just goes to show you what can be accomplished when people stand up for what they believe in peacefully.
Absolutely. It's this inspiring reminder that we don't always have to fight fire with fire, you know? Sometimes choosing to talk, to listen, to find common ground, that can lead to really profound change.
I couldn't agree more. And, you know, thinking about everything that happened back then, it makes you wonder, what if our leaders today, what if they responded to our challenges with that same kind of openness, that same willingness to reconsider how things are done, to choose dialogue over, well, everything else? What kind of world could we build?
Now there's a question to ponder, and a perfect note to end on, I think. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fall of the Iron Curtain. It's a story that continues to resonate even today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.